The pulse of the main reactor hummed through the marrow of her bones. It was a rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. Sector 4 of the orbital dreadnought Ironclad functioned as a graveyard of discarded parts and forgotten people. The air down here carried the permanent sting of ozone-melted copper and cheap synthetic oil. It coated the throat. It settled deep into the lungs, leaving a metallic taste on the tongue. She slept in 8A. Calling it a room gave it too much credit. It was a maintenance tube bolted into the starboard bulkhead, just wide enough to accommodate her shoulders, just long enough to stretch her legs if she kept her combat boots tightly crossed. Condensation dripped constantly from the exposed piping overhead. Drip. Hiss. Drip. Each drop struck the heated exhaust vent, sounding like a dying breath. She craved the cold. The freezing draft slipping through the cracked seals of the hull gnawed at her skin, keeping her sharp, keeping her awake. Sleep in the lower decks remained a luxury that usually ended with a blade slipping between your ribs in the dark. Her hands, calloused and stained black with layers of engine grease, rested flat against her stomach. She wore the grime like plate armor. It masked the sweet floral scent of female. More importantly, it masked the scent of a wolf with no pack. A rogue, a target. A sudden shift in the air pressure popped her ears. The heavy blast doors of the main hangar bay groaned open 2 levels above. The grinding metal tore through the quiet hum of the sector. Bootsteps echoed against the steel grating. These were not the sloppy, dragged heels of the mercenary pilots, who drank themselves into a stupor on cheap rotgut in the mess hall. These steps possessed a lethal synchronization. They fell like hammer strikes on an anvil. Predators. She swung her legs over the lip of her pod and dropped to the catwalk. The grated floor bit through her thin socks. Pulling her heavy canvas jacket tighter around her chest, she dragged the hood low over her face. In the shadows of the maintenance shafts, she faded into a ghost. Down below, the floodlights flickered to life, bathing the hangar in harsh artificial daylight. The base commander, a bloated man sweating heavily through his pressed uniform, hurried forward to greet the arrivals. They walked down the lowered ramp of a stealth gunship that resembled a jagged shard of obsidian. 5 men. All towering. All radiating an aura of raw, unbridled aggression. Shifters. The elite vanguard of the Alpha King. At their center strode the captain. He did not merely walk. He claimed the ground beneath his boots. He wore dark tactical gear, stripped of shiny metals, stripped of anything that might catch the light. His presence sucked the oxygen from the cavernous hangar. Even from her perch 40 feet above, she felt the wave of his dominance crash into her chest. It burned against her skin. It tasted like snow-crushed pine needles and the iron tang of fresh blood. The commander scurried at his heels, gesturing frantically to a line of pilots standing at stiff attention. "Captain Thorne, I have assembled my finest squadrons, the Hellhounds, the Red Talons. Any of these men would welcome the honor to fly your insertion run." Thorne stopped. He did not look at the sweating commander. He did not look at the proud, chest-puffing pilots. He tilted his head back, his square jaw tightening. He scented the air. He breathed in the smog, the jet fuel, the nervous sweat of 30 men, and discarded it all. His eyes, the color of a brutal winter storm, snapped open. "No." His voice rumbled. Low. Grating. It bypassed the ears and vibrated directly down the spine, raising the hairs on her arms. "Sir." The commander wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "These are combat veterans. They lack discipline." Thorne interrupted his gaze, sweeping the upper catwalks. "They reek of cheap victories and unearned arrogance. This mission requires a shadow, someone who knows how to pilot a brick through a needle's eye without waking the guard dogs. I need a pilot who lives in the dark." He stepped away from the neatly arranged formation. He moved with a prowling grace, leaving the bright lights behind and entering the gloom of the maintenance perimeter. She shrank back against the frozen pipes, her breath plumed in the cold air, white against the dark. She pressed a greasy hand over her mouth, forcing her heart rate to slow. Thump, thump, thump. She commanded the beast beneath her skin to coil tight and play dead. Thorne stopped directly beneath her position. He stared up at the maze of catwalks and rusted gratings. "You," he ordered. The single word hit the metal walls like a physical strike. Silence stretched across the hangar. The base commander coughed nervously. "Captain, there is nothing up there but scrap and the mechanics' dens. Sector 4 is garbage. The dregs." Thorne ignored him completely. His eyes locked onto the exact shadow where she hid, piercing the darkness. "Come down." She held her ground. Her mind calculated the distance to the nearest ventilation shaft. 3 seconds to drop, 2 to pry the grate loose, 1 to vanish into the bowels of the ship. A low growl ripped from Thorne's chest, a sound so deep it rattled the wrenches hanging on her utility belt. "I said, come down." The command carried the undeniable weight of an alpha. It slammed into her chest, demanding submission. Her inner wolf snarled in response, thrashing against its invisible cage, refusing to bow its head. She tasted copper. She had bitten her lip until it bled. Slowly, deliberately, she uncoiled from the shadows. She gripped the rusted handrail and vaulted over the edge. The drop measured 15 feet. She landed in a deep crouch on the hangar floor, the kinetic impact absorbed seamlessly by her knees and ankles. No sound, no hesitation. She stood straight, keeping her head bowed, her hood obscuring her features. The elite guard stiffened their hands, drifting toward the heavy sidearms holstered at their thighs. They smelled her defiance. They smelled the rust and the rot clinging to her skin. Thorne raised a single gloved hand. His men froze in place. He closed the distance between them. The blistering heat radiating from his large frame fought the permanent chill of the hangar. He stopped mere inches away. She stared at the thick leather straps crossing his chest, the dull metal handle of his combat knife. "What is your designation?" he asked, the harshness in his tone softening by a fraction of a millimeter. "I fix things," she replied. Her voice emerged raw from disuse, scraping like sandpaper over shattered glass. Thorne reached out. His large, calloused fingers hooked the frayed edge of her hood and pushed it back. The harsh floodlights hit her face, illuminating the streaks of thick grease, the hollows of her cheeks, and the cold, dead glare in her eyes. He leaned in closer. The scent of pine and snow wrapped around her, pulling her forward, demanding she breathe him into her lungs. He closed his eyes for a split second, inhaling deeply right next to the curve of her jaw. A muscle in his cheek twitched. A jolt of electricity sparked where his knuckles brushed her collarbone. When his eyes opened, the winter storm within them had darkened to the color of bruised thunderclouds. "You lie," he whispered, pitching his voice for her ears alone. "You bear flight calluses on your palms. Your irises hold the micro-scars of high-altitude G-force exposure. You hide in the filth because you wait for something to kill." She met his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to flinch away from the fire burning in his stare. "Maybe I just like the quiet." Thorne's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. It was a dangerous expression. A promise of ruin. "Pack your gear," he ordered, stepping back and addressing the commander without sparing the man a single glance. "This one. She flies the Vanguard." "Her..." The commander choked out, his voice cracking. "She sleeps in Pod 8A. She belongs to the scrap crew. She doesn't even have a registered name on the roster." Thorne never broke eye contact with her. The intensity of his stare anchored her boots to the floor, weaving an invisible tether between them. "She does now," Thorne said, his voice echoing through the silent hangar, sealing her fate. "She is mine." The titanium shell of the interceptor offered no comfort. It was a coffin fitted with thrusters designed for speed and slaughter. The air inside the cockpit tasted of recycled oxygen, static electricity, and cold dust burning off the heating elements. She dropped into the pilot seat. The leather groaned under her weight, stiff and freezing. She did not reach for the automated pre-flight interface. Her calloused fingers moved purely on muscle memory, dancing across the manual toggles in the dark. Snap. The primary battery engaged. Click. The avionics grid hummed to life, bathing her grease-stained face in a pale green glow. Thud. The heavy blast door sealed behind her, locking them in. Thorne occupied the navigator's chair directly at her back. The space was meant for a standard human co-pilot, not an alpha of the Vanguard. He filled every inch of the cramped compartment. The ambient temperature in the cockpit spiked immediately. The heat radiating from his massive frame seeped through the carbon fiber backing of her seat, pressing against her spine. It felt like sitting in front of an open furnace. The flight corridor is a dense orbital debris field. The base commander's voice crackled through the comms, dripping with thinly veiled contempt. Standard graduation run for the Hellhound Squadron. Survival rate for first-timers is low. You are cleared for ignition, scrap rat. She reached up and switched the comms channel to mute. Silence rushed back into the cabin, broken only by the low predatory purr of the idling engines. He talks too much, she murmured, her voice a dry rasp. Behind her, Thorne let out a low rumble that vibrated against her shoulder blades. It was not a laugh, but an acknowledgement. Fly, he commanded. A single heavy word. She gripped the twin yokes. She pushed the throttle forward, bypassing the smooth acceleration protocols. The ship did not lift off. It tore itself from the hangar floor. Gravity instantly became a physical entity. It slammed into her chest like a concrete block. Her teeth clamped down, trapping a grunt behind her lips as the interceptor shot out of the dreadnought's launch tube and broke into the pitch-black void of space. Stars blurred into streaks of icy light. Ahead lay the debris field, a churning storm of shattered asteroids, decommissioned satellites, and jagged metal hulls left over from forgotten wars. A graveyard spinning in orbit. Proximity alarms engaging. The ship's AI droned. Red warning lights flooded the cockpit, pulsing in time with the racing beat of her heart. Most pilots would engage the inertial dampeners. They would slow down, relying on the onboard computer to map a safe trajectory through the floating ruin. She reached up and snapped the dampener switch off. The ship bucked beneath her hands, suddenly wild, suddenly raw. She felt every microscopic shudder of the hull, every shift in thrust. The machine ceased to be a vehicle. It became an extension of her own nervous system. She drove the ship straight into the teeth of the storm. A massive chunk of a destroyed lunar cruiser loomed in the viewport, rotating slowly, its jagged edges ready to gut the interceptor. She did not alter her course. The proximity alarm screamed a high-pitched wail of impending death. 10 seconds to impact. 5, 3. At the last possible fraction of a heartbeat, her hands twisted the yokes. The interceptor rolled sharply on its axis, dropping its nose. They slipped through a narrow fissure in the cruiser's broken hull. Sparks showered the viewport as their starboard wing grazed a protruding iron beam. The screech of metal kissing metal sent a beautiful, brutal shiver down her arms. She exhaled slowly, her breathing measured, entering a trance-like state. She danced through the debris. She used the thrusters like a scalpel, carving a path through the impossible chaos. She banked around a spinning asteroid, diving under a cloud of micrometeorites that hammered against the reinforced glass like a hailstorm. The G-force punished her body. 3 Gs, 5 Gs, 8 Gs. The pressure pulled the skin of her face taut. Blood drained from her brain, threatening to drag her down into the black abyss of unconsciousness. She forced her lungs to expand against the crushing weight, utilizing the sharp, rhythmic breathing techniques she had taught herself in the dark. Hiss in, push out, hiss in, push out. Through it all, she kept her wolf buried deep. The beast clawed at the walls of her mind, demanding to surface, demanding to lend its unnatural strength to her fragile human disguise. She shoved it down, locking it in the dark. If she shifted even a fraction, if her eyes bled to gold, or her claws broke through her fingertips, Thorne would know. He would slaughter her for hiding a rogue in his ranks. Behind her, Thorne sat in utter silence. The violent maneuvers did not seem to affect him. The crushing gravity meant nothing to a shifter of his lineage, but he was watching her. She could feel the weight of his stare boring into the back of her neck. He was studying the white-knuckle grip of her hands, the rigid line of her shoulders, the way she refused to flinch when death rushed at the windshield. The cabin heater struggled to compensate for the freezing void outside. The temperature rose. Under the heavy canvas of her jacket, sweat broke out across her skin. It pooled at the base of her throat, trickling down her collarbone. The moisture mixed with the thick layers of synthetic oil and engine grease she used as a shield. The heat began to melt the grime. A single bead of sweat rolled down the side of her neck, leaving a clean track of pale skin in its wake. Behind her, Thorne inhaled. The sound was distinct over the roar of the thrusters. It was a sharp, sudden intake of air. A hunter catching a scent on the wind. For years she had smelled of nothing but rust rot and burnt ozone, but the heat and the sweat were breaking down her armor. The artificial odors peeled away, revealing the truth underneath. It started as a faint whisper in the heavy air. Rainwater striking dry earth. Crushed juniper berries. And beneath that, something dark, sweet, and entirely primal. The undeniable scent of an unmated female wolf. Thorne's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. The reinforced metal groaned, bending under his sudden crushing grip. His pupils blew wide, swallowing the winter storm gray of his irises until only a ring of gold remained. The beast within his chest, a dormant, cynical creature scarred by decades of war, woke up. It slammed against his ribs. It clawed at his throat. Mine. The instinct hit him like a physical blow. It was not a fleeting thought. It was a biological imperative rooted in marrow and blood. The universe narrowed down to the cramped cockpit, the hum of the engines, and the slender, grease-stained neck of the pilot sitting inches from his chest. She pulled the interceptor out of a brutal spin, clearing the edge of the debris field. The stars smoothed out, returning to a calm, velvet black. The G-force released its grip, leaving her gasping softly, her hands trembling as adrenaline flooded out of her system. She had survived the run. She had beaten the record. But as she reached up to wipe a streak of oil from her brow, a heavy leather-clad hand clamped down on her shoulder. The touch burned. It sent a jolt of pure lightning straight down her spine, pooling hot and heavy in the pit of her stomach. Her breath hitched. Her inner wolf let out a whimpering whine, pressing its face against the bars of its cage, desperate to answer the alpha behind her. Thorne leaned forward. His chest brushed the back of her seat. His face hovered inches from her ear. "Turn the ship around." His voice scraped against the sudden silence of the cockpit, deeper than before, laced with a dangerous, possessive edge. "We are going back to the dreadnought." She stared out at the empty expanse of space, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The test was over. But the hunt had just begun. The landing struts kissed the hangar deck. Twin plumes of superheated steam vented from the exhaust ports, hissing like cornered serpents as they met the freezing air of the dreadnought. She popped the primary seal. The heavy canopy hissed open. The immediate rush of bitter ozone-laced oxygen bit into her lungs. She welcomed the sting. It grounded her. It pulled her back from the razor-thin edge of the adrenaline high. Her muscles ached, trembling in the aftermath of the crushing G-force. She unbuckled the harness, her fingers stiff, knuckles bone white. Thorne had already bypassed the lower ramp. He vaulted cleanly over the side of the cockpit, landing on the steel grating with a heavy, syncopated thud that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The base commander waited at the perimeter, flanked by a dozen pilots wearing the insignia of the Red Talons. Their faces were drawn tight. Envy and bruised pride rolled off them in rancid waves, smelling of sour sweat and cheap mess hall gin. A nameless mechanic from the rusted bowels of Sector 4 had just flown a suicide run and brought the ship back without a single scratch on the paint. She had humiliated them. Thorne ignored the commander. He did not look back at her. He strode toward the main concourse, his massive shoulders rolling a dark shadow parting the sea of rigid soldiers. The commander scrambled after him, eager to appease the Alpha King's vanguard. She slid down the access ladder, keeping her head low. The heavy canvas hood hid the gold flashing at the edges of her irises. Her inner wolf clawed at her ribs, agitated by Thorne's scent, demanding she follow the Alpha. She swallowed the instinct. She grabbed her canvas duffel from the supply crate and turned toward the narrow, dimly lit maintenance corridor. She needed the shadows. She needed to reapply the grease to bury the scent of her sweat before anyone else noticed. The corridor smelled of damp rust and rotting wire insulation. The overhead lumen globes flickered, casting long, broken shadows against the bulkheads. A heavy boot scraped against the metal floor grate behind her. She did not stop. Her right hand slipped smoothly into the deep pocket of her coat fingers, wrapping around the cold, textured grip of a modified hydrospanner. A heavy, blunt instrument, perfect for cracking skulls. 3 figures detached themselves from the gloom, blocking the exit. 2 more stepped out from a cross-junction behind her. 5 men. Red talons. "Going somewhere, scrap rat," the leader drawled. He stepped into a pool of flickering light. A deep scar jagged across his chin. He smelled of synthetic stims and unchecked aggression. "You put on a decent show up there," made the commander look like a fool in front of the vanguard. She stood perfectly still. The ambient temperature in the corridor felt colder now. "Move!" She rasped, her voice a rusted blade scraping across a stone. The men laughed. The sound grated against her heightened senses. "We run this deck," the scarred pilot sneered, pulling a serrated combat knife from his thigh sheath. The metal gleamed dull under the dying lights. "Nobody flies out of this bay without paying the toll. Especially not a nameless little stray who sleeps in the exhaust vents. We are going to teach you how to bleed." He lunged. Her wolf surged upward, a tidal wave of primal fury. She calculated the trajectory of the blade. She could drop him. She could snap his wrist, shatter his kneecap, and vanish into the vents before his body hit the floor. But before she could pivot, the air pressure in the corridor vanished. A low, guttural snarl tore through the cramped space. It was not a human sound. It was the promise of ruin, born in the deepest, darkest trenches of a predator's throat. The scarred pilot froze. The knife slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the grating. Thorne stood at the entrance of the corridor. He did not walk toward them. He hunted them. His eyes burned a molten predatory gold that pierced the gloom. The dark tactical gear seemed to absorb the meager light around him. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of crushed pine winter ice and an ancient waking wrath. The men staggered back. Their arrogant posturing crumbled into raw, unadulterated panic. They were human. They did not possess the biology to withstand the sheer crushing weight of an alpha's killing intent. "Captain?" The leader choked out, raising his hands, his face draining of blood. "We were just—" Thorne moved. He crossed the distance in a blur of lethal motion. He did not draw a weapon. He was the weapon. His large hand clamped around the leader's throat, hoisting the grown man off the floor with a single effortless motion. The pilot kicked his boots, thrashing against empty air, his hands clawing uselessly at the thick leather gauntlet, choking the life from him. "You brought steel to my pilot," Thorne whispered. The quietness of his voice held more danger than a scream. He slammed the man into the rusted bulkhead. The metal caved inward with a sickening crunch. The wet snap of a breaking collarbone echoed down the hall. The pilot slumped to the floor, coughing a spray of crimson droplets onto the grating. The remaining 4 men broke. They turned to run. Thorne caught the nearest one by the back of his flight harness, hurling him into a cluster of exposed steam pipes. The pipes ruptured. Boiling white vapor hissed into the corridor, blinding the space. Through the fog, she heard the dull, heavy thud of bone connecting with steel, followed by a wet gurgle. A 3rd man fell, his knee bent backward at an unnatural angle. It was a surgical dismantling, a masterclass in pain. Thorne did not kill them, but he erased their ability to walk to fight, to ever hold a blade again. He left them as broken warnings. The corridor fell silent save for the hissing steam and the ragged moans of the bleeding men. Thorne turned slowly. He ignored the carnage at his boots. His golden eyes locked onto her. He stepped through the swirling vapor, closing the distance until the heat of his chest radiated against her chilled skin. He reached out. His knuckles stained with fresh blood brushed against the line of her jaw. She flinched, expecting pain. Instead, his touch was agonizingly gentle. He leaned down, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, bypassing the grime, bypassing the oil, drinking in the sweet primal scent she could no longer hide. A low rumble of satisfaction vibrated in his chest, resonating directly against her collarbone. "You belong to the shadows no longer," Thorne murmured against her skin, his breath hot and damp. He turned his head, his golden gaze sweeping over the groaning bodies of the red Talons, making sure they remained conscious enough to hear his decree. "She is mine," his voice boomed, carrying the unmistakable weight of a blood oath. "Any man who looks at her loses his eyes. Any man who touches her loses his hands." He looked back down at her, his expression a mix of brutal possessiveness and dark devotion. "Walk with me." The primary airlock hissed shut. Finality echoed in the heavy click of the mechanical bolts. They sat inside the belly of the Obsidian, the stealth gunship assigned for the Vanguard's insertion run. The cockpit design prioritized efficiency over comfort. 2 seats, a narrow central console, a reinforced viewport framing the endless frozen graveyard of space. She initiated the pre-flight sequence. Her fingers danced over the illuminated toggles. Pale blue light bathed the cramped space, catching the sharp angles of her jaw. Thorne claimed the seat to her right. He settled his massive frame into the leather, the material groaning under his weight. He did not strap in. He simply sat, an immovable force of nature encased in dark tactical gear. Navigation lock established, the ship's AI droned. Slipstream drive spooling. She gripped the throttle. "Hold on to something." She shoved the lever forward. The stars outside elongated. They stretched into gleaming silver needles, piercing the black canvas of the void. The slipstream tore open, swallowing the gunship whole. Real space vanished. The world outside the glass became a swirling tunnel of bruised purple and blinding white light. The transition carried a heavy physical toll. Gravity inverted. The air pressure spiked, pressing against her eardrums. She tasted copper. She swallowed hard, forcing her breathing to remain shallow and rhythmic. In the enclosed cabin, the silence grew dense. It carried weight. Without the constant hum of the dreadnought's lower decks, without the smell of rusted pipes and chemical runoff, her senses sharpened to a razor edge. Thorne's presence dominated the tiny cabin. His heat washed over the central console. It melted the chill clinging to her skin. It seeped through the layers of her canvas jacket, warming the scarred tissue beneath. She stared straight ahead, the swirling vortex of the slipstream reflected in her eyes. "You mask your scent well," Thorne murmured. His voice rolled through the quiet, low, coarse. It vibrated against the back of her neck, sending a shiver cascading down her spine. "Engine grease and synthetic ozone?" He continued, leaning slightly toward her. "A clever disguise for a human, a desperate measure for a wolf." Her hands tightened on the yokes. The leather creaked. "It kept me alive. It kept you hidden." "Same thing." He shifted. The sound of thick leather sliding against leather cut through the steady hum of the engines. "Not anymore. The grime is gone. The heat of the interceptor burned it away. The steam in the corridor washed it clean. You smell of rain and nightfall." He inhaled a slow, deliberate draw of breath. "You smell of me." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken claims. The mate bond. The ancient, unbreakable tether that tied 2 shifter souls together. It was a myth in the lower sectors. A fairy tale whispered by the desperate. Yet her inner wolf paced relentlessly inside her chest. It whined. It scratched at the door, begging to answer the call radiating from the alpha sitting beside her. She locked the door. She threw away the key. "I smell like a pilot focused on a suicide run," she retorted. Her voice dripped with frost. "Keep your instincts on a leash, Captain. We drop into hostile territory in 3 hours." Thorne chuckled. The sound resembled stones grinding together in a riverbed. He reached across the console. He did not ask for permission. His large gloved hand covered hers where it gripped the throttle. Lightning arched across her skin. The point of contact ignited. She gasped a sharp, involuntary intake of air. Her muscles locked. The sheer power coursing through his touch threatened to short-circuit her nervous system. "You fight the current," he whispered, turning his head. His golden eyes locked onto her profile. "You build walls of ice. You pretend your blood runs cold, but your pulse races under my hand. Your pupils dilate when I speak. The beast inside you knows its master." She tore her hand away from his. She hit the autopilot toggle and spun her seat to face him. "I have no master." She leaned in, matching his proximity. The distance between their faces vanished to mere inches. She stared directly into the molten gold of his gaze. "I did not survive the slaughter of the Silver Moon Pack to become a pet for the Vanguard." She snarled the words tearing from her throat, raw and unpolished. "I did not rot in Sector 4 eating scraps and sleeping in exhaust tubes to surrender my neck to a collar, even if it is forged from gold." Thorne went completely still. The mention of the massacred pack shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. The predatory heat in his eyes cooled, hardening into a sharp, calculating focus. "Silver Moon," he repeated, "a dead bloodline, wiped out by the Crimson Syndicate 10 years ago." "Not entirely dead," she spat. She pointed a trembling finger at the viewport, at the swirling slipstream carrying them toward their target. "The target coordinates for this insertion run: Outpost Kaelen. It is a Syndicate stronghold." "It is a tactical strike to cripple their supply lines," Thorne corrected smoothly. "For you, maybe," she whispered. Her anger faded, replaced by a chilling, hollow calm. "For me, it is a graveyard. The men stationed at that outpost are the ones who burned my home. They are the ones who wore my father's fangs as trophies." She leaned back into her seat. She crossed her arms, wrapping the canvas jacket tight around her chest to cage the trembling. "So keep your mating instincts to yourself, Captain. I am not looking for a mate. I am looking for an execution block. I am going to steer this ship right into their throats. And when the doors open, I am going to paint the snow with their blood." Silence fell over the cockpit once more. She waited for the reprimand. She waited for him to strip her of her pilot status, to lock her in the holding cell for letting personal vendettas compromise a Vanguard mission. Alphas demanded discipline. They demanded clear minds and unbroken obedience. Instead, Thorne unclasped the heavy combat knife from his chest rig. He flipped it in his hand. He caught it by the blade, offering the textured hilt to her. She blinked, staring at the weapon. "I do not want a pet," Thorne rumbled. The winter storm returned to his eyes, swirling with dark, unspoken promises. "I have enough soldiers. I have enough followers. I do not need obedience from you." He reached out, pressing the hilt of the knife against her palm. He curled her fingers around it, his hand engulfing hers. "A queen does not kneel," he said softly. "She rules. If you want to carve out their hearts, I will sharpen the blade. If you want to burn their outpost to ash, I will carry the torch. I am not here to cage your wrath, little wolf. I am here to unleash it." His thumb brushed over her knuckles. The touch was a vow. "Fly the ship. Get us to the ground, and show me the monster you hide in the dark." She stared down at the heavy steel in her hand. The metal warmed against her skin. For the first time in 10 years, the frozen cage around her heart cracked. She looked back up at the viewport. The slipstream began to thin. The bruised purple light faded, giving way to the cold, hard black of real space. A pale, ice-covered planet loomed ahead, outpost Kaelen. She gripped the throttle. She fed the engines more power. "Hold on," she whispered, her lips curling into a predatory smile. The slipstream spit them out. Real space crashed against the reinforced viewport, a wall of jagged starlight and freezing void. Directly below them, Kaelen hung in the dark, a pale, dead marble wrapped in churning gray storms and razor-sharp mountain ranges. She did not get a single heartbeat to steady her breathing. The proximity alarms shrieked. It was a high-pitched drill biting directly into her eardrums. The tactical display flared crimson, painting the harsh angles of her face in a blood-red glow. 3, 6, 9. 12 heat signatures ignited on the radar, rising rapidly from the dark side of the moon. Syndicate interceptors. They had been waiting in the shadows. Neon green plasma lances stitched across the dark, hunting the obsidian. The first volley grazed their port shields. The kinetic shockwave shuddered through the hull, rattling her teeth and sending a tremor up her arms. "Hold tight," she rasped. She shoved the throttle to the firewall. The twin sublight engines roared, a deep guttural bass that vibrated through the marrow of her bones. G-force stacked onto her chest, a phantom block of iron pressing her deep into the leather seat. She welcomed the crushing pressure. It grounded her. It narrowed her focus to a razor's edge. She merged her mind with the machine. She stopped reading the digital instruments and started feeling them. The heavy yokes became an extension of her own collarbones. The thrusters became her lungs. She threw the gunship into a brutal vertical dive. A syndicate fighter crossed her reticle, attempting to match her descent. Her thumb crushed the firing stud. The nose cannon spat a stream of depleted uranium, tearing the enemy ship apart. It blossomed into a silent, brilliant sphere of orange fire, instantly swallowed by the vacuum of space. She banked hard left, dodging a shower of molten slag from the wreckage. The ship groaned, titanium rivets protesting the unnatural torque. Thorne sat beside her, an immovable monolith of dark energy. He did not bark orders. He did not reach for the auxiliary weapons console to assist her. He simply watched her work. His scent crushed pine needles, and the electric tang of an incoming storm filled the cramped heating cabin. It acted like a primal stimulant in her bloodstream, sharper than any synthetic combat drug. 2 more fighters latched onto their tail. Missile locks chimed, flattening into a continuous nerve-shredding drone. She bared her teeth. Her inner wolf tore at its mental cage, demanding to surface, demanding blood. Her vision sharpened, the stars blurring into silver threads. She mapped the incoming fire, anticipating the enemy's trajectory before their thrusters even flared. She deployed countermeasures, scattering magnesium flares into the void. At the exact same moment, she cut the main drive, spinning the heavy gunship on its axis. Facing backward, flying blind on pure momentum, she fired into the pursuing swarm. The heavy cannons chewed through their shields. 2 more ships erupted into expanding clouds of debris. But the swarm closed the net. They hunted like a coordinated pack, boxing her into a designated kill zone above the planet's atmosphere. The acrid stench of burning wire insulation and scorched metal bled into the cockpit. Sparks rained from the overhead console, hissing as they struck the damp floorboards. The temperature spiked, baking her skin beneath the heavy canvas jacket. Sweat stung her eyes, mixing with the fading remnants of engine grease on her cheeks. She blinked the sting away, refusing to yield a fraction of a second. Then the true trap sprang shut. A Syndicate heavy cruiser dropped its cloaking field directly beneath them. It resembled a jagged iron spearhead, massive and unyielding. The main battery charged a blinding accumulation of purple ion energy, gathering at its bow. It aimed straight for the cockpit. Straight for Thorne. Logic dictated an evasive roll to the port side. That maneuver would expose the reinforced underbelly of their ship to absorb the blow. It would likely save the vessel, but the splash damage would melt the glass of the viewport, boiling them alive in their seats. Instinct overrode logic. The mate bond buried under a decade of ice and denial flared with agonizing brilliance. Her wolf snarled, refusing to let the alpha burn. She wrenched the controls hard starboard. She threw the entire mass of the Obsidian's engineering bay into the path of the beam, sacrificing the engines to shield the nose. The ion beam struck. The cosmos split open. Sound ceased to exist. Only a bone-jarring kinetic wave ripped through the floor beneath her boots. The main console erupted in a geyser of white-hot sparks raining fire over her lap. The sirens died mid-wail. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers of the console and the sickly yellow glow of emergency battery strips. Smoke flooded the air, thick, choking ash that tasted of melted copper and defeat. Main power lost. The ship's backup AI whispered, its digital voice warping and skipping like a broken record. Atmospheric entry. Imminent. Gravity reached up with invisible claws. The dead, burning husk of the obsidian succumbed to the pull of the ice planet. They began to fall. She fought the yokes. Dead iron. The ship tumbled end over end, a piece of blazing scrap metal dropping from the sky. The friction of the upper atmosphere caught them. The black void outside the viewport transformed into a solid wall of roaring plasma. The heat shield screamed. The metal around them began to sing a high, vibrating note of structural failure. The ambient heat inside the cabin turned into a furnace, drawing the moisture straight from her lungs. Thorne moved. He ripped his harness straps away, ignoring the chaotic, shifting gravity of the spinning ship. He leaned over the center console, his massive frame creating a physical canopy over her seat. He braced his thick arms against the bulkhead, caging her completely beneath his chest. He shielded her body with his own, offering his back to the failing viewport. "Brace," he commanded. The rumble of his voice cut cleanly through the deafening roar of re-entry. She looked up. The amber fire tearing at the glass outside bathed his face in a harsh, demonic light. His golden eyes locked onto hers, steady, unafraid. He smelled of ozone-burning fuel and an unbreakable vow. He was ready to take the impact for her. The ground rushed up to meet them. Jagged black rock and endless unforgiving white ice. She closed her eyes. She breathed his scent deep into her chest, letting the pine and winter storm anchor her soul. The world shattered. The silence rang like a struck iron bell. It possessed a weight pressing down on her eardrums, drowning out the hiss of ruptured coolant lines and the snap of dying electrical fires. Pain arrived a heartbeat later. It bloomed in her ribs, a sharp, burning needle threading through her chest with every shallow breath. She tasted ash. She tasted copper. She tasted the freezing, bitter soil of Kaelen. She opened her eyes. Shadows painted the ruined cockpit. The reinforced viewport had vanished, shattered into a million glittering diamonds scattered across the snow. The wind rushed in. It carried teeth. The sub-zero draft bit into her skin, slicing through the heavy canvas of her jacket. She tried to move. She could not. Thorne lay draped across her lap. He had not shifted his position during the descent. Even as the obsidian tore itself apart against the frozen earth, he had maintained his hold, a bulwark of muscle, leather, and bone, shielding her fragile human disguise from the brunt of the impact. She pressed her palms against his chest. He felt like a fallen oak tree, cold, unmoving. Panic, raw and unrefined, pierced her chest. "Thorne!" she rasped. The sound scraped her dry throat. He did not answer. Her fingers scrambled over his tactical rig, searching for the rhythm of his heart. She found the pulse at the base of his throat. It beat slow, sluggish. A predator forced into hibernation. Her hands came away wet. Even in the dim, bruised light of the alien dusk, she recognized the dark sheen coating her trembling fingers. A jagged shard of titanium from the main console had sheared through his armor, biting deep into his side. The scent of his blood hit the enclosed air. It did not smell merely of iron and salt. It smelled of raw, unbridled power. It smelled of lightning striking a mountain peak of deep roots holding firm in a winter storm. It carried the undeniable signature of an alpha. That scent struck the base of her spine like a live wire. For 10 years she had built a fortress around her soul. She had layered it with engine grease, synthetic oil, and the cold apathy of a survivor. She had starved her inner wolf, locking the beast in a cage of shadows, forcing it to play dead so she could walk unnoticed among the scrap. The fortress crumbled. The cage doors blew off their hinges. A low, guttural whine crawled up her throat. It bypassed her vocal cords, echoing from a place of primal instinct. Her blood temperature spiked, boiling away the chill of the Kaelen wind. She braced her boots against the warped floorboards and shoved. Adrenaline laced with the awakening fury of her wolf flooded her muscles. She pushed the heavy debris aside, ignoring the jagged metal biting into her forearms. She hooked her hands under Thorne's arms and dragged him. He weighed twice as much as a normal man, dense with shifter muscle and heavy combat gear. She gritted her teeth, using the leverage of her hips and legs. Her boots slipped on the icy plating. She found purchase. She pulled again. They spilled out of the fractured hull, tumbling onto the pristine, untouched snow of the dead planet. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The sky above churned with heavy gray storm clouds, blotting out the stars. A dense forest of blackened dead pines surrounded the crash site. The trees stood like skeletal fingers pointing accusatorily at the heavens. She dragged Thorne away from the smoking wreckage, hauling him toward the thickest cluster of roots for cover. His boots carved deep trenches in the white snow, leaving a crimson trail in their wake. She laid him flat against a massive frost-covered trunk. Her breath plumed in the air, rapid and harsh. She dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she tore at the heavy leather straps of his vest, exposing the wound. The titanium shard remained lodged in his flesh. Pulling it out would invite death. She packed the edges with clean snow, using the freezing temperature to constrict the blood vessels and slow the bleeding. As she pressed her palms against his side, his large hand shot out, his fingers wrapped around her wrist. The grip held the strength of a vice. Thorne opened his eyes. The winter storm in his gaze had burned away. Only molten gold remained, glowing with an unnatural, feverish heat in the gloom. He stared at her. He mapped the grime smeared across her cheeks, the blood drying on her chin and the wild, untamed panic fracturing her composure. He inhaled, a slow, agonizing draw of breath. "You bleed," he rumbled. His voice barely registered above the howling wind, yet it vibrated straight through her marrow. "I am fine," she snapped, trying to pull her wrist away. "Keep still. The Syndicate patrols will have tracked the crash. We have minutes before they swarm this ridge." He did not let go. Instead, his thumb brushed over the pulse point on her wrist. The touch ignited a spark that raced up her arm, settling hot and heavy in the center of her chest. "The grease is gone," Thorne whispered. A dark, bloody smile curved his lips. The snow washed it away. She froze. The wind whipped her canvas hood back. The harsh elements of Kaelen stripped away the last remnants of her disguise. The cold air rushed over her skin, pulling her true scent to the surface. Rainwater striking dry earth. Crushed juniper berries. And the sweet dark musk of an unmated female. The mate bond snapped into place. It did not ask for permission. It did not negotiate. It slammed into her soul, an invisible anchor tethering her heartbeat to his. The connection flared brilliant and bright, weaving through her veins, tying her life force to the alpha bleeding in the snow. Her wolf rose. The beast surged forward, claiming dominance over the fragile human shell. Heat scorched her eyes. The mundane brown of her irises dissolved, consumed by a predatory luminous amber. A sharp ache throbbed in her gums as her canines lengthened, pressing against her bottom lip. The bones in her hands popped and shifted. Her fingernails hardened, elongating into wicked obsidian claws. She let out a gasp, the sound morphing into a ragged snarl. She leaned over him, her golden eyes burning into his. The submission she had feigned for a decade vanished, replaced by the lethal grace of a predator claiming its mate. The forest around them fell dead silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The distant crunch of heavy boots on snow echoed from the ridge above. The Syndicate hunters had arrived. They tracked the smoke. They hunted the survivors. They expected to find broken prey bleeding in the dirt. She turned her head, aiming her golden gaze at the tree line. The scent of her enemies drifted down the slope. Sour sweat, cheap metal, and the lingering stench of old rot. It was the same stench that had haunted her nightmares for 10 years. She uncoiled from the snow. Her movements held no hesitation, no human clumsiness. She moved with a fluid, lethal precision. The cold did not bother her anymore. The fire of the mate bond pumped through her veins, turning her blood into liquid heat. She looked back at Thorne. He rested against the tree, his eyes locked on her, trusting her to guard his back. She flexed her hands. The obsidian claws caught the faint light of the dying fires. "Let them come." He breathed into the frozen air, his words a vow of carnage. "Show them the queen." The snow compressed with a rhythmic crunch. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The wind carried their scent long before the flashlight beams pierced the gloom. Sour sweat, unwashed wool, and something older. Something that tasted of ash and copper on the back of her tongue. These were not random scavengers. Her nostrils flared. She inhaled the freezing air, dissecting the olfactory layers. Beneath the ozone of their weapons, she caught the distinct rancid musk of the Crimson Syndicate. The same men who had marched through her village. The same men who carried the scent of her burning home on their skin. She became the wind. She shed the clumsy weight of her human disguise, embracing the fluid, kinetic grace of the wolf. Her boots made no sound against the ice. She melted into the dead pines, letting the shadows wrap around her slender frame. She did not merely hide, she ceased to exist. The soldiers reached the smoking crater of the obsidian. They moved in a loose wedge formation. 8 men. The leader, a massive brute wrapped in stolen pelts, kicked a piece of the gunship's hull. The warped titanium shrieked. "Find him!" the brute growled. His voice resembled rocks grinding in a rusted gear. "The Vanguard Alpha, he bleeds. Follow the red trail. I want his head on a pike by sunrise." A necklace hung around the brute's thick neck, white bone against dirty combat armor. Fangs. Silver moon fangs. The sight struck her chest like a physical blow. The mate bond pulsing in her veins fed the ancient grief, transforming it into liquid fire. Her gums ached. The amber light in her eyes intensified, burning like twin forge fires in the dark. She dropped from the canopy. Gravity pulled her down, but she guided the fall. She landed squarely on the shoulders of the rearguard. The kinetic impact drove his knees deep into the frozen earth, a muted snap of cartilage. Before the man could draw oxygen to scream, she brought Thorne's combat knife across his throat. A wet hiss, a spray of dark warmth against the pristine white snow. She pushed off the collapsing body, dissolving back into the brush. "Contact!" A soldier shrieked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. Plasma fire tore through the woods. Neon green beams vaporized the snow, filling the air with a blinding hissing steam. The scent of scorched earth and melted ice choked the clearing. She moved under the barrage. The world slowed. The erratic pulse of the frightened men pounded in her ears like war drums. She closed the distance, her claws dark and jagged as volcanic glass extended. She bypassed their heavy armor, slicing through the softer material at their joints. The tendons severed with a sickening pop. A second man fell, dropping his rifle, clutching his ruined legs. Thorne watched. He leaned against the frost-bitten bark of the ancient pine. The makeshift snow bandage slowed his bleeding, but the wound kept him anchored. Yet his golden eyes missed nothing. He held a salvaged heavy blaster in his right hand. He did not shout orders. He did not attempt to shield her. He understood the sanctity of the hunt. A syndicate grunt raised a thermal rifle tracking her silhouette as she darted between the trunks. He aimed directly at her blind spot. Thorne exhaled a slow breath. He squeezed the trigger. A single blue bolt of energy crossed the clearing. It struck the grunt's visor, shattering the reinforced glass and dropping him instantly. She paused for a fraction of a second, glancing over her shoulder. Thorne lowered the smoking barrel. He gave her a slow, dark nod. He guarded her flank. He let her paint the forest floor red. Only the brute and 2 trembling guards remained. The arrogant swagger evaporated. They stood back to back, their breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The white vapor plumed from their mouths like smoke from a dying fire. "Show yourself!" the brute roared, pulling a serrated machete from his hip. The fangs clattered against his breastplate. The sound sent a fresh wave of heat down her spine. She stepped into the open. The wind caught the edges of her oversized canvas jacket, revealing the dark stains blooming across the fabric. She did not crouch. She walked with the posture of a predator that owned the mountain. Her amber eyes burned, cutting through the gloom. The brute stared. He tracked the unnatural glow of her irises. The heavy machete wavered in his grip. Memory stitched the pieces together. Silver moon. He rasped the word, stripping the moisture from his throat. Impossible. We burned the dens. We left nothing but ash. "You left a spark," she whispered. The voice did not belong to the nameless mechanic who slept in a maintenance tube. It echoed with the authority of a bloodline unbroken. It promised a reckoning. The brute charged. He swung the heavy blade in a desperate downward arc, aiming to cleave her in 2. She stepped into the strike. She flowed around the steel. The edge hissed past her cheek, grazing the cold air. She drove her palm up, striking the nerve cluster under his arm. His grip failed. The machete fell, burying itself in the snow. He swung a heavy fist. She caught his wrist. She locked her fingers around his bones and squeezed. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing. He dropped to his knees, a guttural groan ripping from his lips. She stood over him. She grabbed the leather cord resting against his collarbone. The fangs pressed into her palm. Her heritage. Her family. She snapped the cord with a swift jerk, letting the necklace fall into her pocket. "These are not trophies," she murmured, leaning in close. She drove Thorne's knife upward, slipping the blade cleanly between the plates of his armor. The steel bit deep, piercing the heart. He gasped a wet final breath that tasted of copper and failure. He slumped forward into the ice, joining the dead. The 2 surviving guards dropped their weapons. They turned and ran, fleeing blindly into the treacherous dark of the mountain. She let them go. The cold of Kaelen would claim them long before they reached their base. She stood in the center of the slaughter. The wind howled, brushing the snow over the fallen. She closed her eyes. The scent of spilled blood washed away the smell of the syndicate. The woods felt clean again. The ghost of her pack. The lingering ache of 10 years spent hiding in the dark, it did not vanish, but it settled. It found peace. She turned her head. Thorne sat exactly where she had left him. The heavy blaster rested across his lap. The golden fire in his eyes defied the freezing night. He did not look at her with fear. He did not view her as a feral beast needing a leash. He saw a queen forged in the crucible of revenge. Slowly ignoring the agony radiating from his side, the Vanguard Alpha dipped his chin, a gesture of pure, unadulterated reverence. He bowed his head to her. The heavy thrum of subatmospheric thrusters tore the Kaelen night apart. 3 Vanguard dropships descended from the bruised clouds, their dark hulls cutting through the falling snow like obsidian blades. Blinding white searchlights pierced the canopy of the dead pines, sweeping over the smoking crater of the obsidian and the blood-stained clearing. The beams finally anchored on her. She stood at the center of the carnage. The silver moon fangs rested against her collarbone, a reclaimed legacy heavy with the weight of the fallen. She did not raise her hands in surrender. She did not shrink from the harsh glare. She simply wiped the edge of Thorne's combat knife against her ruined canvas jacket, her amber eyes burning a challenge into the approaching lights. Only when she recognized the silver crest of the Alpha King painted on the lead ship's fuselage did she let her muscles uncoil. The extraction passed in a blur of kinetic motion. Armored medics swarmed the clearing, their boots crunching over the frozen bodies of the Syndicate patrol. They rushed toward Thorne with trauma kits and synthetic blood packs. A low, vibrating snarl echoed from his chest, halting them in their tracks. Thorne batted a sterile gauze pad away, his golden eyes fixed solely on her. He refused the automated stretchers. He refused the painkillers. He allowed only her hands to press the coagulation foam into his torn side. The scent of iodine and sterile cotton filled the transport cabin, failing to mask the raw, primal musk of the mate bond linking them in the cramped space. He leaned his heavy head against her shoulder as the dropship broke orbit, the vibration of the engines humming through their connected frames. 2 hours later, the rescue fleet locked onto the docking clamps of the Ironclad. They did not land in the rusted, forgotten depths of Sector 4. The dropship settled into the polished, hyper-pressurized expanse of the primary command hangar. The main bay hummed with a different kind of tension. It lacked the smell of cheap rotgut and despair. Instead, it smelled of polished leather, weapon oil, and nervous anticipation. Hundreds of soldiers stood in rigid formation. The elite Vanguard lined the central concourse. The base commander paced at the edge of the landing pad, sweating profusely into his pristine uniform collar, clutching a datapad with trembling fingers. They had tracked the telemetry. They knew the obsidian had fallen. They expected to receive bodies wrapped in flag-draped steel. The hydraulic ramp hissed. A cloud of pressurized steam rolled out from the ship's belly, blanketing the deck in a thick white fog. The rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed from the unseen corridor. The base commander stepped forward, rehearsing a eulogy under his breath. The fog parted. She stepped down the ramp first. The collective intake of breath from 300 soldiers sucked the oxygen from the massive room. This was not the nameless scrap rat who slept in the exhaust vents. This was not the ghost who smeared her face in engine grease to hide from the light. The harsh, artificial daylight of the hangar struck her features. The grime had burned away, leaving her skin pale and stark against the dark, blood-soaked canvas of her jacket. She walked with a lethal, fluid grace, each step measured, each movement echoing the predatory rhythm of a waking wolf. The reclaimed fangs gleamed at her throat, but it was her eyes that pinned the crowd in place. The dull, defeated brown had vanished. In its place burned a luminous, unbroken amber, the undeniable mark of a pureblood. She scanned the assembled ranks. Her gaze swept over the remnants of the red talons standing near the back, their bruised faces draining of color as they recognized the woman they had cornered just hours ago. They lowered their eyes, shrinking into the shadows, their bravado crumbling into ash. She reached the bottom of the ramp and stopped. The air around her crackled with a silent, imposing gravity. She claimed the space. A heavy, uneven footstep sounded behind her. Thorne emerged from the steam. His dark tactical gear bore the brutal scars of the crash. A jagged tear exposed the biofoam sealing his ribs. Dried crimson coated his left gauntlet. Yet he did not lean on the medics hovering anxiously in his wake. He dismissed them with a single sharp flick of his wrist. He walked under his own power, an unyielding monolith of muscle and ancient wrath. The base commander rushed forward, snapping a frantic salute. "Captain Thorne, the medical bay is prepped. We monitored the engagement over Kaelen. To survive a direct ion strike and a ground assault, it defies logic. The Vanguard stands ready to receive your orders." Thorne did not return the salute. He did not look at the commander. He walked straight past the trembling man, ignoring the military hierarchy, ignoring the hundreds of elite soldiers watching his every move. He walked until he stood directly in front of her. The distance between them vanished. The heat radiating from his massive frame washed over her, smelling of winter storms, pine, and deep, unspoken devotion. The entire hangar fell into a dead, ringing silence. The hum of the dreadnought's reactor seemed to fade away. Thorne unclasped the broken combat harness from his chest and let it drop to the steel grating. The heavy thud echoed like a gavel strike. He looked down into her amber eyes, the fierce, unbending alpha of the King's Vanguard, a man who had conquered star systems and broken rebellions with his bare hands, did the unthinkable. He lowered his head. His right knee bent, the armored plating striking the polished metal deck with a resounding crash. A shockwave of disbelief rippled through the assembled troops. The base commander dropped his datapad. The Vanguard elites stiffened their expressions, masking profound shock. An alpha bowed to no one. He commanded. He conquered. He stood above all. Yet Thorne knelt at the feet of the grease-stained pilot from 8A. He reached up, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her fingers. He pressed her knuckles against his forehead, anchoring himself to her pulse. "You flew into the dark," Thorne rumbled. His voice carried across the silent bay, deep and resonant, a vow sworn before the stars. "You shattered the cage. You painted the snow with the blood of our enemies." He lifted his head, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. "I swore I would sharpen the blade. I swore I would carry the torch." He turned his head slightly, ensuring his words reached the ears of every soldier, every pilot, every commander in the room. "The Silver Moon Pack is not dead. It rises today. And it claims the Vanguard." He looked back at her, his expression softening into something raw and entirely bare. "You belong to the shadows no longer," he whispered, pitching his voice for her alone, a dark promise binding their souls. "My life is your shield. My pack is your army. Rule them. Rule me. My queen." The mate bond flared, a brilliant, blinding rush of warmth that flooded her chest, chasing away the last lingering chill of the lower decks. The decade of isolation, the bitter taste of rust. The endless freezing nights huddled in a metal tube, it all dissolved into the ether. She did not pull her hand away. She stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. She reached out with her free hand, trailing her fingers over the rough, scarred line of his jaw. She felt the heavy, thundering rhythm of his heart sinking perfectly with her own. "I accept your blade, Captain," she murmured. Her voice, once a dry rasp hiding in the dark, now rang with the clear, unquestioning authority of a sovereign. She looked over his shoulder, her amber gaze sweeping the silent, awe-struck hangar. She was a rogue no longer. "Now!" She commanded, the fire in her eyes promising a new ruthless dawn. "Prepare my ship. We have a syndicate to hunt." The rust and the rot of Sector 4 have burned away, replaced by the heavy crown of a resurrected bloodline. She walked into the dark, a forgotten mechanic, and emerged a queen with a Vanguard Alpha at her feet. But as the dreadnought prepares for war, a shadow lingers in the cold abyss of space. Thorne dismantled her enemies with clinical precision, leaving behind shattered bones and ruined lives, just to prove his devotion. Is a bond forged in such ruthless bloodshed a true sanctuary, or merely a different kind of snare? When an alpha hands you the blade to exact your revenge, does he set you free, or does he awaken a beast that can never be put back to sleep? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Would you embrace Thorne's dark devotion or flee from the fire he brings, if the chill of the orbital deck and the primal pulse of the mate bond kept your heart racing? Leave a like and subscribe to Moonfire Tales. Tap the bell so you never miss another journey into the unknown. Until next time, keep your instincts sharp and never let the shadows claim you.